I never thought a single sentence could stay inside a person for so long that it begins to change the shape of their thoughts. But that is exactly what happened to me. Life does not always break a person loudly. Sometimes it does it in whispers, in ordinary rooms, in moments that look so normal that you fail to recognize their weight until much later. It was one of those days when everything felt repetitive, like every hour was simply repeating the last. The house was awake before I was, as it always was, because in a home like mine, rest is not something that belongs to one person. There is always something waiting to be done, always something that has been left behind for me to pick up, to arrange, to clean, to complete. I had learned over time to move before I was asked, to anticipate before anyone spoke, to carry responsibilities so silently that sometimes even I forgot how heavy they were. But I did not always live like this. There was a time when my identity was not limited to rooms and routines. There was a time when my mind was filled with books, with theories, with discussions that made me feel alive in a way that everyday chores never could. I remember those days clearly, not because they were easy, but because they made me feel like I existed beyond survival. I had worked for something that was mine, something earned through years of discipline and sacrifice. I had stepped into a world where ideas mattered, where intelligence had value, where I was not simply defined by what I could do for others, but by what I could think, build, and achieve. But life has a way of shifting priorities slowly, without announcing that anything important is being taken away. It does not ask for permission. It simply replaces one role with another until you no longer remember where the change began. At first, it was love that changed me, or what I believed was love. The kind that asks you to be present more than ambitious, available more than driven, needed more than independent. I did not resist it, because I believed I could hold both identities at once. I believed I could be everything at the same time without losing anything essential. That belief is what most people call strength, but I have learned that sometimes it is just the beginning of forgetting yourself. And so, slowly, I became the center of everything that needed maintaining, but no longer the center of anything that was growing. That morning was no different from others. The sunlight came into the house in soft fragments, touching the floor in uneven patterns that moved as the day progressed. I remember standing in the kitchen for a long time, not because I was thinking, but because my body had already learned to pause there, as if waiting for instructions from a life that no longer paused for me. There were unfinished tasks everywhere. A sink half-filled, clothes waiting to be folded, rooms that needed attention that no one else seemed to notice. It was strange how quickly disorder becomes invisible to those who live inside it, but becomes a responsibility for the one person who cannot ignore it. I began moving through the house in the familiar rhythm I had developed over years. Not rushed, not slow, just consistent. The kind of movement that does not require thought anymore. My hands knew what to do even when my mind wandered elsewhere. And my mind did wander often to places I did not allow myself to stay for long. I thought about who I had been before this became my entire world. I thought about the version of me who used to wake up with purpose that belonged only to herself. I thought about ambition, not the kind that disappears, but the kind that gets postponed so many times that it eventually stops knocking on your door. And yet I never spoke about these thoughts, not because I did not trust anyone, but because I had slowly learned that certain thoughts make people uncomfortable, especially when they come from someone who is expected to be content with sacrifice. It was in the middle of this ordinary morning that the moment happened. A voice, casual and unquestioning, broke through the rhythm of my thoughts. There was no warning in it, no hesitation, no awareness that anything could be wrong with what was being said. Clean my bathroom before you leave. At first, I did not react, not because I did not hear it, but because my mind needed a moment to understand the weight of how little that sentence had considered everything else I was. It was not just the task. It was never just the task. It was the assumption behind it. The assumption that my time had no shape beyond service. The assumption that my presence existed in relation to duties, not identity. The assumption that I would pause everything I was, everything I had been, everything I might still become, just to fulfill something that was expected of me without question. I stood still for a few seconds longer than necessary. I think part of me was waiting for something to follow, perhaps a softer tone, perhaps recognition that I was more than the instruction being given. But nothing followed. The sentence simply existed in the air, complete and unchallenged, as if it had always belonged there. And in that silence, something inside me moved in a way I cannot fully describe even now. It was not anger at first. Anger would have been simpler. Anger would have been loud, immediate, clear. What I felt instead was quieter and more unsettling. It was awareness. The sudden, sharp awareness of how long I had been reduced without noticing it happening. I had become so reliable that I was no longer regarded as someone who needed consideration. I had become so capable that my capacity was assumed endless. I had become so present in the background of everyone else's life that my own presence in my own life had begun to fade. I finished what I was doing. I always finish what I am doing. That is another thing people like me are trained to do, not by instruction, but by habit. We complete things even when something inside us is shifting, even when something feels misaligned, even when we do not fully understand what is happening within ourselves. But that day, every movement felt different, heavier, as if each task I completed was not just physical but emotional, as if I was carrying something invisible that had begun to grow. By the time the house began to settle into its evening silence, I no longer felt like the same person who had started the day. The world outside continued without interruption, but inside me, something had begun to separate. Not fully breaking yet, not fully forming yet either, just shifting into something unfamiliar. I sat alone for a long time that night. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because for the first time in a long time, I did not want to move without understanding what I was moving toward. And in that stillness, I began to see something I had avoided for years. I was not only a mother. I was not only what I did. I was not only what I gave. And yet, that was all anyone seemed to see anymore. That realization did not change my life immediately. But it began to. Quietly. Irreversibly. The night after that moment did not feel like night in the usual sense. It felt longer, heavier, as if time itself had slowed down just enough for me to notice everything I had been ignoring for years. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. Silence around me had never felt so loud before. I kept replaying the sentence in my head. Clean my bathroom before you leave. It was not the words alone that stayed with me. It was the tone, the ease, the absence of awareness that I was a person who existed beyond the task being assigned. It was spoken the same way someone would remind a chair to stay in place, or a thing to remain useful. And that realization should have hurt immediately, but instead it settled into me slowly, like something sinking too deep to remove easily. I tried to dismiss it at first. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that every family has moments like this where words come out without meaning anything deeper. That is what I wanted to believe, because believing anything else would require me to confront something I had avoided for a long time. But thoughts do not disappear just because we ask them to. They return in quieter forms, in memories, in patterns, in small moments that suddenly begin to look different when seen together. I started remembering things I had ignored before. Times when I had spoken and not been fully heard. Times when my presence in a room only mattered when something needed to be done. Times when my achievements were briefly acknowledged and then quickly replaced by expectations of what I should do next. I had always told myself that this was normal, that this is what responsibility looks like, that love is expressed through duty. But that night, I began to question whether I had mistaken usefulness for value. I sat near the window for a long time. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Lights from distant houses flickered softly. Somewhere far away, a dog barked and then went silent again. Everything in the world outside me seemed balanced, unchanged, indifferent to the shift happening inside me. And I thought about who I used to be. Not just in terms of identity, but in terms of feeling. There was a version of me who once felt like she had direction that belonged only to her. A version of me who made decisions without constantly calculating how they would affect everyone else. A version of me who believed effort would lead to recognition, and recognition would lead to freedom. But somewhere along the way, freedom had been replaced by responsibility. And responsibility had quietly expanded until it filled every space I once called my own. I realized something else that night, too. No one had taken my identity away from me. I had slowly given it away in pieces. Not intentionally, not suddenly, but gradually, through acceptance, through silence, through the belief that enduring everything was the same as being strong. I did not sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw fragments of my life layered on top of each other. Not dramatic memories, but small ones. A moment where I had stopped reading because someone needed help. A moment where I had postponed something important for myself because someone else's need felt more urgent. A moment where I had said, "It's okay," when it wasn't, just to keep peace in a space that never asked me what I needed. Morning came too quickly. The house began to wake up again, as if nothing inside me had changed. That was the most confusing part, how the world continues even when a person inside it has shifted. I moved through the usual routine, but I felt different inside my own movements. It was like watching myself from a slight distance, observing habits that no longer felt entirely mine, but still controlled my actions. When I passed through the hallway, I noticed how naturally I adjusted things that were slightly out of place. When I entered the kitchen, I noticed how quickly my hands reached for tasks before I even decided to do them. It was automatic, deeply learned, a life built on repetition of service so consistent that it had become instinct. And yet, inside all of that, something new had begun to form. A question. Not loud, not demanding. Just persistent. What am I beyond this? I did not have an answer, but for the first time, I allowed the question to exist without pushing it away. Later that day, I found myself standing still in the middle of a room for no clear reason. Everything around me was familiar. The same walls, the same objects, the same routines waiting to be completed. But I was noticing them differently, as if seeing them for the first time from a perspective I had never allowed myself before. I began to notice how much of my life was built around anticipation of others, how little of it was centered around my own intention, how many decisions I made without asking whether I wanted them, and instead asking whether they would keep things running smoothly for everyone else. It was not a dramatic realization. It did not come with sudden clarity or emotional collapse. It came like a slow exposure to something that had always been there, but had been hidden by habit. And that was more unsettling than anything else. Because if this had always been true, then I had been living inside it without seeing it. That thought stayed with me through the rest of the day, through conversations I half listened to, through tasks I completed without reflection, through moments where I smiled automatically even when my mind was elsewhere. And by the time evening returned, I understood something I did not fully want to understand. The life I was living was not just busy. It was structured in a way that left very little room for me to exist as a person separate from responsibility. And I did not know yet what to do with that realization. But I knew I could not unsee part 4. The space inside me that had first appeared as a quiet awareness began to grow in ways I could not fully control. It did not grow like something loud or dramatic. It grew like something subtle taking root beneath the surface, spreading slowly, changing the way I responded to everything without announcing itself. On the outside, nothing changed. That was the strange part that made everything more confusing. My life still looked the same rooms, the same responsibilities, the same expectations waiting to be fulfilled without delay. The same routine that had once felt like structure and now felt more like repetition. But inside that routine, I was no longer fully present in the same way. It started with small moments of hesitation, a pause before responding, a second thought before moving, a quiet awareness of how quickly I used to surrender my time without even considering it mine in the first place. I began to notice how often my decisions were not actually decisions at all, but responses shaped by years of conditioning. Someone would speak, and I would move. Someone would expect, and I would adjust. Someone would need, and I would disappear into that need without asking where I went in the process. And now, for the first time, I was seeing the pattern instead of living inside it blindly. This awareness did not make me rebellious. It did not make me loud. It made me still. Still in a way that felt unfamiliar. Still in a way that created space between me and everything I was doing. One afternoon, I stood in a room holding something I had picked up without remembering why. My body had moved automatically, but my mind had not followed. I looked at it and felt a strange distance from my own actions, as if I was observing someone else performing my life. That was when I realized something deeper. I had become so efficient at fulfilling expectations that I had stopped registering my own participation in them. It was not that I was forced into everything. It was that I had learned not to question, and that lack of questioning had slowly turned into invisibility within my own existence. The realization did not come with anger. It came with something heavier. Clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not leave things untouched. I began to notice how often I interrupted my own thoughts to attend to someone else's needs, how quickly I abandoned personal reflection the moment responsibility appeared, how rarely I allowed myself to finish a thought about myself without redirecting it toward someone else. It was as if my mind had been trained to exit itself constantly. And I started wondering when I had agreed to that, or if I ever had. There were moments when I tried to dismiss these thoughts, to return to the comfort of routine, to convince myself that this was just a phase of overthinking. But even those attempts felt different now. The dismissal no longer worked as smoothly as it once did. Something inside me was refusing to fully let go of what I had started to see. One evening, I found myself standing near a window again, watching the world outside move in its usual rhythm. People passing, lives continuing, time flowing forward without hesitation. Everything looked normal. Everything looked untouched. But I no longer felt fully aligned with it. It was not separation from the world itself. It was separation from the version of myself that had accepted everything without question. And that version of me now felt distant. Not gone. Just no longer in control. I thought about how long I had lived in that state without recognizing it. How many years had passed while I slowly reduced myself into roles that were expected of me. How many times I had convinced myself that exhaustion was the same as purpose. That sacrifice was the same as identity. That being needed meant being valued. And I realized something that made my chest tighten, not in pain exactly, but in recognition. I had been living a life where my presence was constantly required, but my inner self was rarely acknowledged. That realization did not immediately change anything outside me, but it changed everything within me. Because once you begin to see your life as something you are participating in rather than something you are simply inside of, you can no longer remain the same participant. That night, I did not sleep easily. Not because I was disturbed, but because my thoughts had become too active to settle into silence. I kept returning to one question. If I am not only this role, then what else have I been ignoring about myself? It was not a question I could answer yet, but it was no longer a question I could avoid. And that difference changed everything quietly, without permission, without announcement, without turning back. The question did not leave me the next morning. It stayed with me like a presence that refused to step aside, even when I tried to return to my usual rhythm. I woke up, moved through the familiar routines, and yet something inside me remained slightly detached from all of it, as if I was participating in a life that no longer fully matched the way I was beginning to think. That was the most difficult part. Nothing around me had changed, but I had. And when a person changes internally without any external shift to confirm it, everything starts to feel uncertain. I continued my responsibilities as always. I prepared what needed to be prepared. I cleaned what needed to be cleaned. I responded when spoken to. I carried out tasks that had no beginning and no clear end. On the surface, I was still the same, still reliable, still present, still fulfilling every expectation without visible resistance. But inside, I was no longer disappearing into it the same way. There was a growing awareness of every action, as if I was watching myself perform a role I had once accepted without question. It was not dramatic, it was subtle, but it was persistent. And persistence is what makes change unavoidable. At moments, I found myself pausing longer than necessary before responding to requests. Not refusing, not reacting negatively, just pausing. That small gap between expectation and response felt like something significant, even if no one else noticed it. Because inside that gap, I existed. For a long time, I had not realized how rarely I allowed myself to exist in that space. One afternoon, I noticed something simple that affected me more than I expected. I noticed how quickly my name was used only in relation to tasks, not in conversation, not in curiosity, not in acknowledgement of who I was beyond function, but in connection to what I needed to do. It was subtle, almost invisible in daily life, but now I was hearing it differently. And it made me question how long I had been reduced to that pattern without recognizing it. I began to think about conversations I had been part of over the years. How often I had listened more than I had spoken. How often I had redirected attention away from myself, even when someone briefly asked about me. How often I had felt that my deeper thoughts were unnecessary to share, because there was always something more practical to attend to. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had trained myself to make myself smaller in communication. Not because I was told directly to do so, but because it made everything smoother. Less complicated. Less demanding. But smoothness has a cost, and over time, I was beginning to see what that cost had been. That evening, something small happened, but it stayed with me longer than expected. A simple request was made in the usual tone, the same tone I had grown used to over years. But this time, instead of immediately responding, I hesitated. Just for a moment. That hesitation was invisible to anyone else, but inside me, it felt like a boundary had appeared where none existed before. A boundary between expectation and automatic obedience. I still completed what was asked. I still moved forward with responsibility, but I did not do it in the same unconscious way as before. There was awareness now, awareness of choice, awareness of self, awareness that I was not simply a function moving through instructions. And that awareness changed the emotional texture of everything. Later that night, I found myself sitting quietly again, not because I had no work, but because I needed space that was not immediately filled with someone else's need. That was new. I had rarely allowed myself to pause without purpose tied to responsibility. And in that silence, I felt something I could not ignore. A growing emotional distance. Not from people themselves, but from the role I had been occupying for so long that it had replaced my sense of individuality. It was not resentment. It was not anger. It was something more complicated. It was recognition that I had been existing in a structure where my value was measured by how quickly I responded to everyone else's needs, and not by who I was when I was not responding. And that realization did not break me, but it unsettled something deeply rooted. Because once you see that you have been living in a pattern, you begin to wonder how many other patterns you have not yet noticed. That night, my thoughts did not settle easily. They kept circling back to one idea. If I continue like this without questioning anything, will I ever meet myself again? It was not a dramatic question, but it was one I could no longer silence. And that was the beginning of something I did not yet fully understand, but could already feel changing the direction of my inner life. After that night, something in me began to shift in a way that was no longer only internal reflection, but emotional distance. It was not a decision I made. It was something that happened gradually, like a tide pulling back from a shore that had been constantly covered for too long. I still performed my responsibilities. That part of me did not disappear. I still moved through the same spaces, completed the same tasks, answered the same expectations. From the outside, there would have been no visible difference. Life would have appeared unchanged, stable, predictable. But inside, I was no longer fully merging with it. There was a separation forming, small, quiet, but undeniable. A space between what I did and how deeply I absorbed myself into doing it. And that space changed everything. I began to notice how often I had been emotionally absent from myself, not in the sense of being numb, but in the sense of never fully turning inward long enough to register my own needs without immediately redirecting attention outward. My attention had always been trained to move away from me the moment it landed. Now, that movement was slowing, and I was beginning to remain with myself longer. It was uncomfortable at first. Sitting with my own thoughts without immediately attaching them to responsibility felt unfamiliar, almost unnatural. There were moments when I instinctively tried to escape that stillness by finding something to do, something to fix, something to complete. But I noticed that impulse too now. I was noticing everything. And noticing changes a person more than they realize. One day, I found myself standing in a room without urgency. There was nothing demanding immediate attention, and instead of filling the space with activity, I stayed still. That stillness used to feel like wasted time. Now it felt like something else entirely. It felt like presence. A presence I had not given myself permission to experience for a long time. And in that moment, I became aware of something simple but powerful. I had been living in constant motion, not because life required it, but because stillness would have forced me to see myself more clearly. And I had not been ready for that before. But I was beginning to be ready now. Over the following days, I started noticing how quickly I responded to requests out of habit rather than intention. There was a difference I had never paid attention to before. Intention feels chosen. Habit feels automatic. And I realized how much of my life had been built on automatic response. That realization did not make me resist immediately. It made me observe first. And observation slowly weakens automatic patterns. I also began noticing something else, how rarely I was included in conversations that were not centered around tasks or needs. It was not always intentional. It was just the way roles settle in over time. People get used to a version of you, and that version becomes the only one they interact with. I had become the reliable one, the one who adjusts, the one who completes, the one who is present only when something is required. And I began to wonder when I had stopped being seen beyond that. Not in a dramatic or blaming way, but in a quiet, factual way that felt difficult to ignore. One evening, I found myself sitting alone longer than usual. I was not waiting for anything. I was not avoiding anything. I was simply sitting without immediately attaching my existence to usefulness. And that felt unfamiliar enough to be unsettling. But I stayed. And in staying, something softened inside me. Not pain. Not anger. Something closer to recognition. I was still here. Not just as a role. Not just as a responder. But as someone who existed even when nothing was being demanded. That realization did not change my circumstances, but it began to change how I understood myself within them. And once that understanding begins, it does not stop easily. It continues quietly, beneath everything else, reshaping the way a person sees even the most ordinary parts of their life. I did not know yet where this would lead, but I knew I was no longer moving through my life in the same way I had before. And that was no longer something I could reverse. The change inside me did not announce itself, but it began to show in the smallest interruptions of habit. Where I once responded instantly, I now paused. Where I once adjusted without thought, I now considered. Where I once accepted every expectation as natural, I now felt something quietly resisting the automatic flow. It was not rebellion. It was awareness learning how to stay longer inside itself. At first, these changes were so subtle that no one would have noticed them. Even I almost missed them. A delay before answering. A moment of silence before moving. a thought that remained with me instead of being immediately replaced by responsibility. But internally, these small shifts were not small at all. They were the beginning of reclaiming space I had never realized I had lost. One day, a familiar pattern appeared again, an expectation delivered in the same effortless tone I had grown used to over the years. Normally, I would have already been in motion before the sentence even finished forming. My body would have responded before my mind fully registered the request. But this time I stopped. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough for me to notice that I had not immediately surrendered myself to the expectation. In that pause, something unfamiliar happened. I asked myself whether I actually needed to respond right away. That question alone felt like stepping outside a long-established boundary. I still ended up doing what was needed. Nothing external changed. The task was still completed. The structure of the day remained intact, but internally the experience had shifted. I was no longer disappearing into the action in the same way. There was awareness now. And awareness changes obedience into choice. Over the following days, I began noticing how many of my actions had been shaped by unspoken expectations rather than conscious decisions. It was not that anyone was forcing me in obvious ways. It was that I had learned to interpret silence as instruction and presence as obligation. And I had rarely questioned that interpretation. Until now. One afternoon, I found myself in a situation where a request was made in the usual casual tone, but instead of responding immediately, I felt something rise inside me, not resistance, but clarity. A recognition that I did not need to abandon myself instantly to maintain harmony. I did not refuse, but I did not move immediately either. That difference was small, but it felt enormous inside me. For a brief moment, I experienced something I had not felt in years. A sense of ownership over my own time. It passed quickly, but it left an impression that did not fade. Later that day, I noticed how my mind kept returning to that moment, not with guilt, not with confusion, but with curiosity, as if I had discovered a part of myself that had been inactive for a long time and was now slowly waking up. And that curiosity began to replace fear. Fear of disrupting patterns. Fear of disappointing expectations. Fear of being seen differently. Because I began to understand something important. The version of me that always complied was not the only version that existed. It was the version that had been practiced the most. That realization changed the way I moved through the rest of the day. I was still responsible. I was still present. I was still fulfilling what needed to be done. But something inside me was no longer fully absorbed into it. There was a line now between what I did and who I was while doing it. And that line gave me something I had not felt in a long time. Breathing space. That evening, I sat alone for a while longer than usual again. Not because I was escaping anything, but because I was beginning to understand the value of existing without immediate purpose. It was uncomfortable at first, as if I was breaking an old internal rule I had never consciously agreed to. But I stayed with it. And slowly, the discomfort softened. What remained was something quieter. A growing sense that I was no longer entirely defined by response. I did not know what this would become, but I knew I was no longer fully the person who had started this journey. And that was no longer reversible. By the time I reached this stage of my inner change, nothing around me had altered in any visible way, yet everything within me felt as if it was slowly reorganizing itself. It was not chaos. It was not sudden transformation. It was more like a quiet rearrangement of truths I had always lived with but never fully examined. Life still expected the same things from me, the same routines, the same availability, the same quiet endurance, and I still carried them. I still showed up where I was needed. I still fulfilled responsibilities without allowing the outer structure of my life to collapse. But the difference now was that I no longer disappeared completely inside it. I was beginning to stay aware of myself while doing everything I had always done. And that awareness changed the emotional weight of every action. There were moments when I caught myself observing my own behavior as if I were watching someone else who had been trained to respond without hesitation. It was not detachment in the sense of indifference. It was recognition, a clear understanding that I had been operating within a pattern so long that it had started to feel like identity. And once identity is questioned, it can never return to its original form. One evening, I stood in a familiar space and suddenly felt something unexpected, an emotional heaviness that did not come from exhaustion, but from realization. I began to see how much of my life had been shaped by repetition of expectation rather than expression of self. I had become so consistent in fulfilling roles that I had stopped asking whether I had chosen them freely. And that question, once it arrived, did not leave easily. It followed me through the day, through conversations, through silence, through every task I completed, without fully engaging my inner self in it. There was a moment that day when I paused longer than usual before responding to something. It was not intentional at first. It was instinctive hesitation. But in that hesitation, I felt something shift again. I noticed that I was no longer rushing to fill every expectation immediately. And that space, however small, felt like a disruption in a long-standing pattern. Not a conflict, a crack in automatic living. That evening, my thoughts became more intense, not in a chaotic way, but in a deeply reflective one. I began to revisit my past choices, not to regret them, but to understand how they had accumulated into my present. I saw how many times I had chosen peace over expression, how many times I had chosen acceptance over clarity, how many times I had believed that being needed was enough to define being valued. And slowly, a difficult understanding formed. I had not been fully present in my own life for a long time. I had been present in everyone else's expectations of me. There is a difference between the two, and I was only beginning to see it now. And with that realization came something heavier. Grief. Not loud grief, not dramatic grief. A quiet mourning for the parts of myself I had not lived fully. For the version of me that had been postponed so many times that she no longer felt urgent. For the ambitions that had been placed behind responsibility until they became faint. For the identity that had been absorbed into roles without resistance. I did not cry immediately. I did not react outwardly. But inside, something softened and broke at the same time. It was not destruction. It was awareness of loss. And awareness of loss creates space for something new, even if it does not feel like it at first. That night, I could not return to my usual emotional state. There was no way back into unconscious participation. I had seen too much now, understood too much now, felt too much now. And once a person sees the structure they have been living inside, they cannot unsee it. I began to understand that my life had not been taken from me by a single moment or a single person. It had been shaped slowly, through acceptance, repetition, and silence. And while that realization carried pain, it also carried something unexpected. Possibility. Because if it was shaped, it could also be reshaped. Not easily. Not quickly. But not impossibly either. And that thought stayed with me longer than the grief. Longer than the confusion. Long after the night had ended. It was the first time I began to consider that my life might not only be something I endure, but something I could still participate in differently. After that night, something inside me no longer allowed me to return to the exact version of myself I had been living as before. It was not a decision I made. It was more like a threshold I had crossed without realizing there was a point of no return. The awareness I had reached did not fade, and even when I tried to slip back into routine, it remained quietly present beneath everything I did. Life around me continued exactly as it always had. The same expectations, the same rhythm, the same assumption that I would always adjust, always respond, always remain available in the same predictable way. And I did continue. I did not suddenly change my external behavior. I did not disrupt the structure of my responsibilities. But internally, I was no longer fully inside it. There was a separation now between what I did and what I felt while doing it. And that separation changed everything. It made even simple moments feel different. A request no longer passed through me automatically. A routine task no longer absorbed my entire attention. A familiar expectation no longer felt invisible. Everything became something I was aware of participating in, rather than something I was unconsciously absorbed into. And awareness, once it stabilizes, begins to demand honesty. I started asking myself questions I had never allowed myself to fully ask before. Not dramatic questions, not overwhelming ones, but quiet, persistent ones. Why do I always assume my time belongs to others first? When did my own needs become secondary without discussion? At what point did my silence become the easiest way to keep everything functioning? These questions did not come with immediate answers, but they changed the way I moved through each day. I was no longer simply reacting. I was observing my reactions. And that observation created distance from my old patterns. One day, I found myself in a situation where I would normally have responded instantly, without thought, without pause. It was a familiar expectation, one I had fulfilled countless times before without hesitation. My body almost moved on its own, ready to comply before my mind fully engaged. But this time I stopped. Not outwardly dramatic, not confrontational, just still. And in that stillness, I felt something shift again. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully register what I actually wanted in that moment. Not what was expected, not what was habitual, but what I felt internally. And that awareness alone created a tension I was not used to holding. Because for so long, my choices had been aligned with external needs rather than internal clarity. I still did what was required. I still maintained responsibility, but I did it differently now, with awareness, with hesitation that turned into consideration, with a quiet acknowledgement that I was participating rather than disappearing. And that difference, though invisible to others, was becoming central to my inner transformation. That evening, I found myself sitting alone again, not escaping, not avoiding, but simply existing without immediate purpose attached to my presence. And in that space, I felt something I had not felt clearly in a long time. A sense of self that was not defined by usefulness. It was fragile, it was new, it was still forming. But it was there. And once you recognize a self that exists outside of expectation, you can no longer fully return to a life where that self is ignored. I began to understand that my emotional distance was not detachment from life. It was reconnection with myself. And that reconnection came with grief, confusion, and a strange kind of strength I was still learning how to carry. Because seeing your life clearly does not immediately fix it. It first makes you aware of everything that needs to change. And that awareness is both painful and necessary. That night, I no longer felt like I was simply enduring my life. I felt like I was standing inside it, slowly beginning to understand that I had more presence in it than I had ever allowed myself to recognize. And that understanding was the beginning of something that could not be reversed. Only continued. There comes a point in quiet transformations when awareness is no longer enough to stay hidden inside. It begins to press outward, not as rebellion, not as explosion, but as something more controlled and more dangerous, clarity that refuses to shrink again. That is where I found myself. I was still the same in appearance. I still moved through the house, still carried out responsibilities, still responded when spoken to. Nothing about my outer life had changed enough for anyone to name it as change. But inside me, the balance had shifted so clearly that even silence felt different. I was no longer simply existing inside expectations. I was observing them. And that observation created a kind of tension I had never carried before. It started with something small again, something so ordinary it would have once passed through me without leaving any trace. A request delivered in the usual tone, the usual timing, the usual assumption that my time would naturally adjust itself around it. But this time, I did not move immediately. I stayed still. Not in refusal, not in anger, just still. And in that stillness, I felt the familiar pressure rise, the old internal conditioning that always pushed me to respond quickly, to avoid discomfort, to maintain smoothness. That pressure had guided so much of my life that I used to mistake it for responsibility. But now I could see it more clearly. It was not responsibility. It was habit shaped into identity. For a moment, I almost gave in, almost returned to the automatic version of myself that resolved tension by disappearing into action. That version of me was familiar, safe, predictable. But something inside me held the line. Not loudly, not forcefully, just steadily. And I realized I was no longer moving purely from expectation. I was choosing, even if the choice was small, even if the action did not change. The internal shift was no longer reversible. I still completed what needed to be done, but I did it with awareness now. Awareness that I was present, awareness that I was participating, awareness that I was not simply a tool responding to demand. And that awareness changed how I felt while doing everything. It created a distance that was not coldness, but recognition. That I was more than the function I was being placed into. Later that day, I found myself reflecting on something that had never felt important before. How often I had been spoken to in terms of what I could do rather than who I was. How rarely conversations had existed with me that were not centered around need, task, or expectation. It was not something I could blame anyone for in a simple way. It had grown slowly over time, shaped by routine, by convenience, by the way roles settle in relationships without anyone formally deciding them. But now I could see it, and seeing it made it impossible to fully ignore. That evening, I experienced something unfamiliar again. I set a small boundary, not spoken in a dramatic way, not announced with force, but held internally with quiet certainty. I did not immediately surrender my time the way I used to. I did not rush to dissolve myself into someone else's urgency. And nothing collapsed. The world did not punish me for it. The structure of life remained intact. That realization was more powerful than I expected, because it showed me that the fear I had been carrying for so long, the fear that stepping back even slightly would disrupt everything, was not entirely accurate. It showed me that I had been overextending myself far beyond what was actually required. Not because I had to, but because I had learned to. That night, I sat alone longer than usual again, but this time, the silence did not feel like emptiness or confusion. It felt like space where I could exist without immediate demand, space where my thoughts did not have to be redirected into usefulness. And in that space, I felt something new forming. Not certainty, not resolution, but direction. A quiet understanding that I could no longer continue exactly as I had before. Not because everything around me demanded change, but because I now understood myself differently. And once that understanding settles in, life cannot remain unchanged for long. After the boundary I had held inside myself, something subtle began to change in the atmosphere of my days. It was not that anyone noticed it directly, and it was not that anything around me shifted dramatically. The house still functioned the same way it always had. Expectations still existed. Responsibilities still came without pause. Life still continued in its familiar structure. But my relationship to all of it was no longer the same. I was no longer entering my roles without awareness. I was no longer dissolving into them without thought. There was a presence inside me now that observed everything before I responded to it, as if a part of me had finally stepped slightly outside the automatic rhythm I had lived in for so long. And once you begin to observe your own life instead of only performing it, everything starts to feel different, even the things that never change. One day, a moment came that would have once passed without any internal resistance. A simple expectation, spoken in a familiar tone, carrying the same assumption that had existed for years. The assumption that I would comply without delay, without question, without pause. But this time, I did not immediately move. I stayed where I was. And in that pause, I felt the old pressure rise again. The learned urgency, the instinct to smooth things over, to maintain harmony, to avoid discomfort by immediately becoming what was needed. It was strong, it was familiar, it was deeply embedded in me. But it was no longer absolute. For the first time, I allowed that pressure to exist without obeying it immediately. And something shifted. Not outside. Inside. A realization formed slowly, but clearly. I was not refusing life. I was refusing automatic disappearance. That difference mattered more than I had ever understood before. I still fulfilled what was needed. I still carried responsibilities. I still maintained the structure that had always been there. But I was no longer doing it at the cost of my own awareness. There was a line now. A quiet internal line between obligation and identity. And I was beginning to recognize that I had crossed it without ever being told it existed. As the days continued, I started noticing something else. How differently I was being perceived when I did not immediately respond in the same way as before. It was subtle, not openly spoken, but present in the pauses of others, in the way expectations adjusted slightly when they were not instantly met. It made me realize how much of my previous life had been shaped not just by what was asked of me, but by how quickly I had always responded. Speed had been mistaken for availability. Availability had been mistaken for identity. And identity had been reduced to function. But now, I was beginning to slow that pattern. And in slowing it, I was beginning to see it. One evening, I found myself reflecting more deeply than I had before. Not just on recent changes, but on the long stretch of time that led me here. I thought about how often I had been present for others while being absent from myself. How often I had considered my own thoughts secondary, my own needs optional, my own voice unnecessary unless it served something else. And I felt something inside me that was not regret in the usual sense. It was recognition. Recognition that I had lived inside a version of myself that had never been fully questioned. And that version had slowly become my default. But it was not my entirety. That understanding created a quiet emotional intensity that I could not ignore. Not pain alone, but awareness layered with something like awakening. Because I was no longer only seeing what I had been. I was beginning to see what I had not yet become. And that possibility carried both fear and strength at the same time. Fear, because change always disrupts familiarity. Strength, because staying aware made returning to blindness impossible. That night, I did not feel lost. I felt in transition. And transition is never comfortable. But it is often necessary. I sat for a long time in silence again, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I was beginning to understand that silence could also be a place where I met myself without interruption. And in that meeting, something inside me became steady. Not fixed. Not complete. But steady enough to continue. And I knew then that I was approaching something I could not yet fully name. But I was no longer afraid of reaching it. There is a moment in every quiet transformation when you realize you are no longer the same person who began it, not because everything around you has changed, but because you can no longer unsee what you have learned about yourself. That moment does not arrive with noise. It arrives gently, almost unnoticed, until one day you simply understand that returning to the old version of your life is no longer possible. That is where I was now. The house still moved in its familiar rhythm. The same expectations still existed. The same responsibilities still appeared without hesitation. Nothing external had broken, nothing dramatic had shifted, nothing had forced change upon me. And yet I knew, with a certainty that did not need explanation, that something fundamental inside me had already crossed a line. I was no longer living only as a response. I was living as an awareness. And awareness, once fully formed, does not shrink back into blindness. It only deepens. There had been no final confrontation, no single explosive moment that changed everything. Instead, there had been a series of small awakenings, each one quietly dismantling the idea that I existed only in relation to what others needed from me. And now, I could see clearly what I had not been able to see for so long. I was not only what I did. I was not only what I gave. I was not only what I carried for others. I was someone who had been living underneath all of that, quietly waiting to be acknowledged even by myself. One ordinary day, I found myself standing in the same space where so many of these realizations had begun. But this time, I did not feel confusion or emotional conflict in the same way. There was still emotion, yes, but it was no longer tangled. It had begun to settle into clarity. When another expectation came, I noticed it, but I did not lose myself inside it. I responded, but not by disappearing. I responded while remaining present to my own existence. That small difference, once unimaginable, now felt natural. And in that moment, I understood something deeply important. Freedom was not leaving everything behind. Freedom was no longer abandoning myself while staying. That understanding did not erase the past. It did not undo years of conditioning or silence or emotional weight, but it gave those years meaning in a new way. They were no longer just losses. They were part of the path that had brought me back to myself. As I moved through the day, I noticed something else changing around me too. The way space felt. The way silence felt. The way my presence felt inside my own life. It was as if I was no longer a background figure in a story centered on everyone else. I was present in my own existence again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But fully enough to matter. And that was the beginning of a different kind of life. A life where I still cared. Still loved. Still fulfilled responsibilities. But no longer at the cost of erasing myself in the process. That evening, I sat quietly and realized something that brought a calmness I had not felt in a long time. I had not lost my identity. I had only stopped recognizing it under everything I had been carrying. And now I could see it again. Not as something I needed to rebuild from nothing, but as something I had finally allowed to surface. There was no perfect ending in the sense of everything becoming effortless. Life would still require effort. It always does. But the difference now was that I was no longer absent from my own participation in it. I was here, and I would remain here. Not only as someone who serves, not only as someone who carries, but as someone who exists beyond what is expected. And for the first time in a long time, that existence did not feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. A quiet, steady beginning. One that belonged fully to me. Even after I had reached what I thought was understanding, life did not suddenly become easy. That is something I learned quickly. Awareness does not remove responsibility. It only changes the way you carry it. I still woke up to the same rooms, still faced the same expectations, still moved through the same structure of life that had been built over years without my conscious approval. But something inside me had changed so deeply that even the smallest interaction now felt different. People did not suddenly understand me. That was not the result of my transformation. In fact, at first, nothing around me reacted at all. The world does not adjust itself just because a person finally wakes up inside their own life. And that can feel lonely in a way that is difficult to explain. There were moments when I almost slipped back into old patterns. Moments when it would have been easier to simply obey without thinking, to avoid the discomfort of awareness, to return to the version of myself that never questioned anything, because questioning creates distance. But I had already crossed that threshold. There is a strange point in human change where ignorance becomes heavier than truth. I had reached that point. Even if I wanted to go back, I could not do it without feeling myself disappear again. And I had started to value my presence too much to allow that. One day, something small happened again. Not dramatic, not painful, just ordinary. But ordinary things are often where everything reveals itself. A request was made, and for the first time I did not feel the automatic pull to erase myself immediately. I listened, I understood, but I did not rush. And in that pause, I felt something powerful rise inside me. Not rebellion, not anger, but identity. A quiet, steady recognition that I was not here only to fulfill expectations. I was here to exist alongside them. That may sound simple, but for someone who has lived years without that recognition, it feels like reclaiming oxygen. I still helped, I still contributed, I still cared, but I no longer abandoned myself in the process. And that changed everything, not externally but internally. Because now, every action had two layers: the action itself and my awareness inside it. And I was no longer willing to lose the second layer. Extended Part 14, Realization of Value. Something else began to happen as I continued in this new state of awareness. I started noticing how much I had underestimated my own presence in my life. Not because others did not value me, but because I had never fully learned to value myself outside of usefulness. That realization came slowly. At first, I thought my worth was tied to how smoothly everything functioned when I was present. If things went well, I felt needed. If things depended on me, I felt important. If I was required, I felt like I mattered. But now, I began to see the hidden truth beneath that belief. Being needed is not the same as being seen. Being useful is not the same as being understood. Being present in someone's routine is not the same as being present in their awareness of you as a person. And I had confused these things for a long time. That confusion is quiet. It does not hurt immediately. It only shows its cost much later, when you realize how little space you gave yourself to exist beyond function. I started doing something I had not done in years. I began asking myself what I felt before reacting. Not what was expected, not what was required, but what was actually there inside me. And at first, the answers were unclear. My mind was so used to skipping myself that it struggled to return. But slowly, I began to hear myself again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. And honesty, once it returns, cannot be ignored. Extended Part 15, Final Emotional Resolution. There was no single moment where everything became perfect. That was never going to happen. Life does not reward awareness with immediate comfort. But something more important happened. I stopped disappearing inside it. I remained, even in responsibility, even in expectation, even in silence. I remained present with myself. And that changed the meaning of everything I did. My life was still the same life on the outside. But on the inside, I was no longer absent. I was no longer lost inside roles that consumed me without question. I was no longer only what others needed me to be. I was also someone who existed independently of all of that. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like stability. Not the stability of routine, but the stability of self-recognition. I did not need to leave everything behind to become whole. I only needed to stop abandoning myself while staying. And that was enough to change everything. Not instantly, not perfectly, but permanently.